A chance encounter that changed everything. Thomas Whitmore stood at the large window of his penthouse apartment, gazing out at the cityscape below. At 52, he had everything he had ever dreamed of, or at least, that's what everyone believed. A successful career in finance, a luxurious home with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a collection of fine art, and a wardrobe filled with the finest suits money could buy. But as he stood there, whiskey glass in hand, watching the blinking lights of traffic, he felt something gnawing at him, a deep, hollow loneliness that no amount of wealth or success could fill. His life had been a relentless pursuit of professional excellence. Climbing the corporate ladder had been his singular focus since graduating top of his class at Harvard. While his colleagues settled down, started families, and built lives outside the office, Thomas had buried himself in work. His world was one of numbers, investments, and high-stakes deals. And now, as he stood alone in his apartment, he realized he had built his empire at the cost of something invaluable: human connection. The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. That Saturday, as he had for the past 6 months, Thomas left the comfort of his home and made his way to the community shelter. It had started as a simple attempt to give back, an act of charity, something his late mother had always encouraged him to do. But over time, these volunteer days had become the only thing in his life that truly felt meaningful. Here, away from the sterile world of finance, he saw people struggling, fighting to survive, yet clinging to hope with a tenacity that humbled him. As he ladled steaming soup into bowls, he noticed a young girl maneuvering through the crowded room, a look of mild panic on her face. She was no older than 16, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, her expression one of quiet determination. She weaved through the tables, calling out a name. Jaden. Jaden, come back here. A small boy, no older than 5, dashed past Thomas, giggling as he ducked under a table. The girl, exasperated, nearly ran into Thomas, stopping just in time before she knocked the ladle out of his hands. "I'm so sorry," she said, breathless. "My little brother. He never listens." Thomas chuckled, steadying himself. "No harm done. I take it you're his sister." She nodded, glancing over her shoulder at the little boy, who had now taken to hiding behind a stack of chairs. "Yes, I'm Olivia. Jaden's my youngest brother." Her expression turned serious. "There are 7 of us, actually." Thomas's brows raised. 7 siblings. That must be quite a challenge. Olivia bit her lip, looking down at the worn-out sneakers on her feet. "Yeah, especially since our parents passed." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His gaze softened. "I'm so sorry." She shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "It's been 2 years. Foster care has been difficult. We've been shuffled around a lot, but they're talking about separating us now." Her voice cracked slightly as she looked up at him, a silent plea behind her weary eyes. "I've been trying to keep us together, but I don't know how much longer I can." Thomas felt something stir inside him, something deep, something he couldn't quite name. "That must be terrifying," he said gently. She nodded. "It is. We're all we have left." Thomas glanced at the boy, now peeking out from behind the chairs, his big eyes filled with mischief, but also a hint of something else. Fear. The thought of these siblings being torn apart after already losing so much felt wrong in every possible way. "Where are you all staying now?" he asked. "A temporary foster home," Olivia said. "But the social worker says it's too much for one household to handle all of us." Thomas's mind raced. He thought about his massive empty apartment. The silent dinners, the untouched guest rooms, the echoing hallways that reminded him daily of what he was missing. Could he? No, the thought was absurd. He was a businessman, not a father. He had no experience with children, let alone 7 of them. The idea of taking in even one child, much less an entire group of siblings, was overwhelming. But as he watched Olivia walk away, her shoulders squared with the burden of responsibility no teenager should have to bear, He couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been anything but coincidence. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The city lights twinkled outside his window as he sat in his study, staring at the framed photo of his parents. His mother's warm smile, his father's steady hand on his shoulder. It all felt like a lifetime ago. He had grown up in a home filled with love, with parents who had nurtured and guided him. Olivia and her siblings had none of that now. The following morning, Thomas found himself doing something completely out of character. He drove to the foster agency. "I'm interested in adopting," he said to the receptionist, the words feeling foreign yet right in his mouth. The woman blinked at him. "Adopting? Do you have a particular child in mind?" He took a deep breath. "Yes, 7 of them. A family on the edge of separation." Thomas Whitmore sat stiffly in the waiting room of the Bridges Foster Care Agency, tapping his fingers against the polished wooden armrest of his chair. His mind raced with doubts, but he forced himself to stay calm. The words he had uttered the day before still echoed in his mind. Yes, 7 of them. The receptionist had given him a strange look, as if he had just spoken in an alien language, and truthfully, it did sound absurd. A single, childless businessman adopting 7 children. He wasn't even sure if he could keep a houseplant alive, let alone be a father to a group of siblings who had endured more hardship than he could fathom. Yet here he was. "Mr. Whitmore." A woman's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and sharp features. She extended her hand. "I'm Linda Carter, the senior social worker here. Please, come into my office." Thomas followed her down a narrow hallway, his polished dress shoes clicking against the tiled floor. The office was small but inviting. Family photos and colorful drawings covered the walls. A bookshelf lined with adoption manuals, psychology books, and framed certificates stood in the corner. "Please, have a seat," Linda said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Thomas sat down, clasping his hands together as she studied him carefully. "So," she began, leaning forward slightly, "I was told you came in yesterday, expressing interest in adopting 7 children." "That's correct," Thomas replied, his voice steady. Linda pursed her lips. "That's quite an unusual request. Most people are hesitant to adopt even one child, let alone a group of siblings." Thomas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know how it sounds. But I met Olivia and her younger brother Jaden at the shelter last week. She told me about their situation, about how the system is planning to separate them because no single foster home can handle them all." Linda nodded slowly. "Yes, Olivia and her siblings. *** Malcolm, 14, Zuri, 12, twins Xavier and Amari, 9, Layla, 7, and Jaden, 5. *** have been in and out of multiple placements. Every time they get settled, something happens. Either the foster parents can't handle all of them, or they simply don't want the extra responsibility. And as you said, the system is now pushing for their separation." She paused, signing. "It's heartbreaking. They've been through a lot. And Olivia, well, she's shouldered most of the burden. She's more of a parent to her siblings than a child herself." Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He had seen it in Olivia's eyes, that quiet desperation of someone who had no choice but to grow up too fast. Linda leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk. "Mr. Whitmore, forgive me for being direct, but I have to ask, why? Why would a wealthy single man with no parenting experience suddenly decide to adopt 7 children?" Thomas hesitated. He had asked himself that same question countless times. "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "All I know is that my life has been empty for a long time. I've spent years chasing financial success, and I have nothing to show for it except an apartment full of expensive furniture and a name on a corporate door. But when I met Olivia, I saw something that reminded me of what truly matters: family, connection, the things I lost along the way." Linda regarded him carefully. "That's a noble sentiment, Mr. Whitmore. But raising children, especially traumatized children, isn't about sentiment. It's about commitment. It's sleepless nights, tantrums, school meetings, medical emergencies. These kids will test you in ways you can't imagine. I understand that, Thomas said firmly. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Linda was silent for a moment before nodding. All right, let's see where this goes. The adoption process is long and brutal. You'll need home visits, background checks, financial assessments, psychological evaluations, you name it. Thomas swallowed. He had expected a challenge, but hearing it laid out so plainly made the reality settle in his gut like a rock. But Linda continued, if you're serious about this, we can start the process today. Thomas nodded. Let's do it. The first meeting. A week later, Thomas found himself standing in the children's current foster home, a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of town. The living room was cramped, littered with school bags, scattered socks, and mismatched shoes piled near the door. Olivia sat on the couch, her back stiff, her fingers laced tightly together in her lap. The younger children sat around her, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. Linda stood beside Thomas, offering a reassuring nod before addressing the kids. Everyone, this is Mr. Whitmore. He's interested in helping you stay together. Malcolm, the oldest boy, narrowed his eyes. How? By throwing some money at the problem. His voice was sharp, challenging. Thomas met his gaze evenly. No, Malcolm. By adopting you. The room fell silent. Olivia's mouth parted slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. The twins exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Little Layla clutched a tattered teddy bear, her small fingers curling around the fabric as if holding on for dear life. You're lying, Malcolm said flatly. Thomas exhaled. I'm not. You're rich, Malcolm countered, his arms crossing over his chest. Guys like you don't take in kids like us. You donate money, shake hands, and go home to your fancy apartments. You don't actually stay. A flicker of pain crossed Olivia's face at her brother's words. It was clear this wasn't the first time someone had made a promise that eventually fell apart. I don't expect you to trust me right away, Thomas admitted. But I'm here because I want to keep you all together. I know what it's like to have a home that feels empty, and I don't want that for any of you. Silence stretched between them until Zuri, the 12-year-old, spoke up. If we come live with you, she hesitated, biting her lip. Will we have to be different? Thomas frowned. Different how? Zuri looked down, kicking her feet lightly against the couch. You know, act fancy, talk a certain way, be perfect. Thomas's chest tightened. What had the world already made these kids believe about themselves? No, he said softly. You don't have to be anything except who you are. For the first time, Olivia's expression softened. Then, in the quietest voice, Jaden, the youngest, whispered, Will we have to leave each other? Thomas knelt down, meeting Jaden's wide, fearful eyes. No, buddy. That's the whole point. I want to keep you together. The little boy blinked, his fingers gripping the hem of Olivia's shirt. Okay, he murmured. Thomas felt something in his chest crack wide open. Malcolm exhaled, his posture still stiff, but some of the fight had drained from his shoulders. We'll see, he muttered, but don't think we'll make it easy on you. Thomas grinned. I wouldn't expect anything less. For the first time, Olivia let out a breath, one that sounded a lot like hope. The beginning of a new chapter. Thomas Whitmore stood outside his penthouse apartment, his hand hovering over the door handle. Behind him, 7 children shifted uneasily, their eyes filled with emotions that ranged from curiosity to outright defiance. This was it, the moment he had spent weeks preparing for. The adoption process had not been easy. Endless paperwork, home inspections, psychological evaluations, and personal interviews had pushed him to his limits. There were moments he thought the agency would reject him. that they would decide he was unfit to care for a group of traumatized children. But somehow, against all odds, he had been approved. Now, standing in front of his luxury apartment with 7 children who had never known stability, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Terror. Are you gonna open it, or just stand there all day? Malcolm, the oldest boy, crossed his arms, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Thomas exhaled and pushed the door open. Welcome home. The kids hesitated before stepping inside. The penthouse was massive, sleek, and modern, with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The floors were polished hardwood, and the furniture was a mix of expensive leather and custom designs. Everything about the place screamed money. Olivia's eyes darted around warily, as if she expected someone to pop out and tell them it was all a mistake. The younger children, however, were less reserved. Jaden, the youngest at 5, ran across the shiny floor, laughing as his shoes squeaked. This place is like a hotel, Zuri gasped, touching the smooth glass of the dining table. Yeah, Malcolm muttered under his breath, a hotel we don't belong in. Thomas heard him but chose not to respond. He had expected resistance. It would take time for them to see this as home, to see him as someone they could trust. I know it's different from what you're used to, Thomas said carefully. But this isn't just my house anymore. It's yours too. I want you to feel comfortable here. Malcolm snorted. Right, because we all totally belong in a place like this. Malcolm, Olivia warned, shooting him a look. What? Malcolm shot back. It's true. We're a bunch of foster kids with nothing. We don't fit here. Silence fell over the room. Thomas saw it then, the fear beneath the anger. Malcolm wasn't just being difficult. He was preparing for failure. Preparing for the moment Thomas would wake up and decide they weren't worth the trouble. Thomas met Malcolm's gaze. You belong here as much as I do. Maybe even more. Malcolm scoffed, but Thomas could see the way his jaw clenched, the way he avoided looking him in the eyes. Thomas turned to Olivia. Would you like a tour? She hesitated before nodding. Yeah, I think that'd be good. Adjusting to a new life. The first week was chaos. Thomas had spent years organizing million-dollar financial deals, handling billion-dollar mergers. But nothing could have prepared him for raising 7 children. The first disaster happened at breakfast. Zuri and Xavier got into a fight over who got the last waffle, which resulted in syrup being spilled all over Thomas's pristine kitchen floor. Malcolm burned toast so badly the fire alarm went off, causing a full-blown panic attack in Jaden. Mary knocked over a carton of orange juice, and before Thomas could react, Layla, in an attempt to clean it up, only made it worse. By the time everything was settled, Thomas stood in the middle of the mess, completely overwhelmed. How do parents do this? He muttered to himself. Trial and error, Olivia said from the kitchen counter, sipping coffee. Mostly error. Thomas sighed, rubbing his temple. You could have warned me. I did warn you. She wasn't wrong. School was another battle. The kids were placed in a prestigious private academy, one that Thomas had arranged through some very expensive connections. He had thought giving them the best education would be an easy way to set them up for success. He was wrong. The first week, Malcolm got into a fight. A classmate had made a racist remark, and Malcolm, never one to back down, had punched him in the face. Zuri, shy and soft-spoken, struggled to adjust. She refused to participate in class discussions and barely spoke to anyone outside of her siblings. Jaden cried the first 3 days, clinging to Olivia at drop-off and begging not to be left alone. The only one who adjusted somewhat well was Olivia, but only because she had spent years learning to adapt. That night, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, utterly exhausted. This was a mistake, he muttered, his head in his hands. Olivia sat across from him, watching him carefully. You know, she said, I used to think that, too. Thomas looked up, confused. After my parents died, Olivia continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, I thought there was no way I could take care of my siblings. I mean, I was a kid, but I didn't have a choice. And every time I messed up, every time I thought we were gonna fall apart, I just kept going. She looked him straight in the eyes. You just have to keep going. Thomas took a deep breath. He wasn't alone in this, and neither was she. Small moments of change. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to shift. One night, Thomas found Zuri sitting in the library, reading quietly. She didn't look up when he walked in, but she didn't leave either. What you reading? He asked. She hesitated before holding up a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Good book, Thomas said, sitting down across from her. Zuri studied him carefully before sliding the book across the table. I just finished it. You can read it next, if you want. It was a tiny gesture, but for Zuri, it was everything. Malcolm was harder to crack. He was distant, angry, always waiting for the moment Thomas would fail him. But one night, after another school fight, Thomas sat him down. You can't just punch every problem away, Thomas said. Malcolm scoffed. Yeah. And what do you know about my problems? Thomas leaned back. More than you think. When I was your age, I was angry too. Malcolm frowned. Why? Thomas hesitated, then sighed. My dad walked out when I was 10. I spent years resenting him. I thought if I worked hard enough, became rich enough, it would fill that hole. But it didn't. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he muttered, Yeah. Well, my dad left too. And my mom, she's gone. So maybe I'm just wired to be angry. You're not, Thomas said firmly. You're wired to survive. For the first time, Malcolm didn't have a snarky comeback. He just nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Breaking barriers and building bonds. 3 months later, Thomas Whitmore never thought he would find himself at a parent-teacher conference. Yet here he was, sitting in a too small plastic chair, his knees crammed under an elementary school desk as he faced Jaden's first-grade teacher, Ms. Coleman. I appreciate you coming in, Mr. Whitmore, she said warmly, flipping through a folder labeled Jaden Whitmore. Thomas still wasn't used to seeing that name on school documents. His name. It's my pleasure, he said, shifting uncomfortably. Miss Coleman smiled, but Thomas could tell something was off. Jaden is a wonderful student, she started cautiously. Thomas frowned. He had learned that whenever someone started with a compliment, bad news was coming. But, he prompted. Miss Coleman sighed. He's struggling to adjust. He doesn't talk much. He refuses to participate in class activities. And, she hesitated. And what? He panics when he has to separate from his sister Olivia. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He should have expected this. Jaden had lost his parents at 3 years old. Olivia had practically raised him. Of course he would cling to her like a lifeline. Mr. Whitmore, I understand that Jaden's been through a lot, Ms. Coleman continued. But if he doesn't learn to be independent, he's going to struggle socially. Thomas nodded, rubbing his jaw. What do you suggest? We need to encourage him to make friends outside of his siblings. Maybe get him involved in extracurricular activities. Thomas exhaled. All right. I'll talk to him. As he left the school, he glanced down at his phone. 12 missed calls from work. He ignored them. For the first time in his life, his career wasn't the most important thing anymore. His family was. A sibling's sacrifice. That night, Thomas sat Jaden down at the kitchen table. Jaden stared at his plate, pushing his food around with his fork. Buddy, Thomas said gently, Miss Coleman told me you've been having a hard time at school. Jaden shrugged, his little fingers gripping the fork tightly. You know you can talk to me, right? Jaden hesitated. Then, so softly it was almost a whisper, he said, What if they take Olivia away? Thomas's heart clenched. Nobody is taking Olivia away, he assured him. But they said we couldn't stay together before, Jaden murmured, eyes welling with tears. What if they changed their mind? Thomas reached across the table, placing a firm but gentle hand on Jaden's shoulder. Listen to me, he said. That's never going to happen. You, Olivia, and your brothers and sisters, you belong together. And I'm going to make sure you stay together, no matter what. Jaden blinked up at him, uncertainty still clouding his young face. Okay, he whispered. It wasn't completely convinced, but it was a start. Malcolm's rage. The next battle came 2 weeks later. Malcolm got into another fight, this time at basketball practice. Thomas was called to the school again, but by the time he arrived, the damage had already been done. Malcolm sat outside the coach's office, his lip busted and a bruise forming under his eye. Are you serious? Thomas snapped, crossing his arms. Another fight. Malcolm, this is the third time. Malcolm scowled, tilting his head back against the wall. He was talking trash. Talking trash. Thomas ran a frustrated hand down his face. That's what you're calling it. He said I didn't belong here, Malcolm muttered. Thomas's anger cooled immediately. He said, what? Malcolm exhaled sharply. He said I don't belong at this school. That people like me don't make it. That we're just gonna end up in juvie or broke or dead. Thomas clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. Malcolm, he said, voice tense, you can't just punch every person who insults you. So what do I do? Malcolm snapped. Just let them say whatever they want. No, Thomas said firmly. But you have to be smarter. You're better than them. If you let them push you into violence, they win. Malcolm's jaw clenched. Do you think I don't know what that feels like? Thomas continued. I was the only black kid in a prep school full of rich, privileged kids who thought I didn't belong. You know what I did? Malcolm didn't answer. I outworked them, Thomas said. I became so good at what I did that they couldn't ignore me. And I want you to do the same. Malcolm's gaze flickered. You really think I can? I know you can, Thomas said. Malcolm looked away, but his shoulders relaxed, just a little. An unexpected surprise. As the months passed, the family slowly settled into a routine. Jaden made one friend, a shy boy named Elijah, who loved dinosaurs as much as he did. Zuri started participating in class. Aisha's bakery business took off after Thomas helped her launch an online store. Even Malcolm, stubborn, angry Malcolm, began to trust Thomas, little by little. But just when things seemed to be getting better, life threw another curveball. It started with a phone call. Thomas was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a terrible idea, given his lack of cooking skills, when his doctor's office called. Mr. Whitmore, this is Dr. Simmons. We got your blood test results back. Thomas froze. Everything okay? There was a pause. Your stress levels are dangerously high, the doctor said. And we found something concerning in your heart scans. Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. What does that mean? It means, the doctor said carefully, that you need to slow down. If you don't, you're going to end up in the hospital, or worse. Thomas exhaled. He could handle stress. He could handle work pressure. But this. He had 7 kids depending on him. He couldn't afford to be sick. Mr. Whitmore, the doctor prompted. Thomas forced a smile. I'll be fine. But as he hung up, his hands were trembling. He had spent so much time saving them. Now, who was going to save him? Later that night, Thomas sat alone in his home office, staring blankly at the medical report in his hands. His heart condition wasn't critical yet, but if he didn't make drastic lifestyle changes, things could spiral out of control. Stress-induced hypertension, increased risk of cardiac arrest. The words blurred together as he ran a hand over his face. The doctor had warned him. You're pushing yourself too hard. Between your job and raising 7 kids, something's got to give. If you don't slow down, Your body is going to force you to. But how could he slow down? These kids depended on him. They had already lost one family. He couldn't let them lose another. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He quickly shoved the medical report into a drawer. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Olivia peeked in. "You okay?" she asked, stepping inside. Thomas forced a smile. "Yeah, just going over some paperwork." Olivia studied him for a long moment. She had always been the most perceptive of her siblings. She saw through him too easily. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine," he lied. She didn't buy it, but she didn't press. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "You know," she said, tilting her head, "you remind me a lot of myself." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You don't ask for help," she said simply. He opened his mouth to protest, but she continued. "I spent years pretending I had everything under control. After our parents died, I told myself that if I just worked harder, if I just held everything together, then everything would be fine. But it wasn't fine." Thomas swallowed. He knew what she was saying. "And when I finally broke down?" Olivia shrugged. No one was surprised, because they knew I had been struggling. They were just waiting for me to admit it. She leaned forward. "You're not a superhero, Thomas. You don't have to do this alone." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I appreciate the concern, Olivia, but I'm fine." "Really?" She sighed, shaking her head. "Okay, if you say so." But the doubt in her voice lingered. As she left the room, Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe she was right, but admitting he needed help felt like admitting defeat, and he wasn't ready for that. The breaking point. 2 weeks later, Thomas collapsed. It happened in the middle of dinner. The kids were arguing over what to watch for movie night when suddenly everything blurred. His chest tightened. His vision dimmed. And before he could say a word, his body gave out. The last thing he heard before blacking out was Jaden screaming. Waking up in a hospital bed. When Thomas opened his eyes, Olivia was there. Her arms were crossed, her eyes red and puffy. She had clearly been crying. "Hey," he croaked. His throat felt like sandpaper. She didn't smile. "You passed out, Thomas, in front of everyone." He groaned, pressing his hands to his face. "What happened?" "You had a stress-related cardiac episode. The doctors said you were lucky. If it had been worse." She trailed off, blinking rapidly. Thomas exhaled, guilt settling in his chest. "How long was I out?" 2 days. His eyes widened. "The doctor said you need rest. You can't keep pushing yourself like this, Thomas. You're not invincible." He swallowed hard. He had spent so long holding everything together that he had forgotten to take care of himself. And now he had scared the hell out of his kids. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Olivia sniffled. "Don't apologize. Just let us help you, okay?" Thomas nodded. Maybe it was time to stop pretending he could do this alone. The kids step up. When Thomas returned home, things were different. The kids had taken over. Malcolm started handling house repairs and running errands. Olivia took over budgeting, organizing bills, and making sure Thomas went to his doctor's appointments. Aisha handled meal prep, ensuring Thomas ate healthy meals. Zuri and Xavier helped with chores, keeping the house tidy. Layla and Jaden were put in charge of making sure Dad laughs at least once a day. At first, Thomas felt guilty. But then he realized something. They weren't just doing it for him. They were doing it for each other. Because for the first time in their lives, they had something worth protecting. A family. A late-night conversation. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Malcolm found Thomas sitting on the balcony. "You should be resting," Malcolm said, leaning against the railing. Thomas smirked. "Shouldn't you?" Malcolm shrugged. "I've been thinking a lot." Thomas waited. "About before," Malcolm said. When you first took us in, I thought it wouldn't last, that you'd change your mind or get tired of us, or—" Thomas frowned. "Malcolm." "But you didn't," Malcolm cut in. "Even when we made it hard. Even when you had every reason to quit." Thomas studied him carefully. "Why didn't you?" Malcolm asked quietly. Thomas took a deep breath. "Because you're mine." Malcolm stiffened. "You and your brothers and sisters. You're not just some kids I took in," Thomas said. "You're my family. And family means you don't give up on each other." Malcolm was silent. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. "That's kind of cheesy." Thomas laughed. "Yeah, maybe." Malcolm hesitated. Then, for the first time ever, he said, "Thanks, Dad." Thomas froze. Malcolm realized what he said too late. His face turned red. Don't make a big deal about it." Thomas grinned. "Too late." Malcolm groaned, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I'm going to bed." As he turned to leave, Thomas called after him. "Hey, Malcolm." Malcolm paused. "I love you, kid." Malcolm hesitated. Then, so quietly it was almost lost to the wind, he said, "Love you too." And just like that, the last barrier between them broke. For the first time, Malcolm let himself believe. He wasn't alone anymore. The strength of a family. 6 months later, Thomas Whitmore had always been in control. He was the man with a plan, the one who never faltered, never showed weakness. But ever since his collapse 6 months ago, things had changed. He had slowed down, partly because he had no choice, and partly because his children wouldn't let him overwork himself into another hospital stay. And somehow, despite all his worries, they were doing just fine. No, scratch that. They were thriving. Jaden no longer clung to Olivia's side at school. He had joined the art club, made a few friends, and even brought home a painting of their family. Himself, Olivia, Malcolm, Zuri, the twins, Layla and Thomas. The little boy had drawn them all holding hands. When Thomas saw it, he had to step out of the room to compose himself. Zuri had begun tutoring kids in math, and Xavier had joined the school's robotics team. Amari was taking piano lessons, something Thomas had insisted on after hearing her hum beautifully to herself in the hallway one night. Layla, the quietest of them all, had started writing poetry. And Malcolm, the hardest shell to crack, was now captain of his basketball team. His anger hadn't vanished overnight, but he had learned to channel it. Thomas couldn't have been prouder, but things weren't perfect. Because no matter how hard they tried, one problem still loomed over their heads. They were going to lose their home. The secret they couldn't hide anymore. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice. His financial situation had spiraled after his hospitalization. The medical bills, combined with the cost of raising 7 kids, had drained his savings faster than he ever anticipated. The mortgage payments had fallen behind. And now, if he didn't come up with the money soon, they would have to leave. The thought of his kids, being uprooted again made his stomach twist. He had tried hiding it from them. But Olivia found the notice first. "Dad, what is this?" Thomas froze at the sound of Olivia's voice. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, the foreclosure notice clenched in her hands. His heart sank. "Olivia." Her voice wavered. "You aren't going to tell us." Thomas ran a hand down his face. "I didn't want you to worry." Her eyes flashed with hurt. "Are we going to lose our home?" she asked quietly. Thomas exhaled. "I don't know." For a long time, Olivia just stood there. Then she turned on her heel and walked out. Not out of the house, but into the living room, where all the other kids were. "Everyone, we need to talk." The Matthews siblings form a plan. That night, the kids gathered in the living room. Thomas sat in his armchair, surrounded by 7 determined faces. It felt like an intervention. Malcolm was the first to speak. "We're not losing this house," he said firmly. Thomas sighed. Kids, I appreciate the thought. But, no, Olivia interrupted. We're not going to sit back and let you handle this alone. Not this time. Aisha set down a notebook full of scribbled calculations. I've been crunching the numbers, she said. If we work together, we might be able to come up with enough money to stop the foreclosure. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? We mean, Malcolm said, we're going to fix this. Thomas blinked. Were they serious? We've already started brainstorming ways to bring in money, Zuri added. If we all contribute, we can at least cover part of what's owed. But how? Malcolm smirked. Sit back, Dad. We got a plan. Operation Save Our Home. The kids launched into action. Aisha expanded her bakery business, taking online orders and selling at local markets. Her cupcakes became a hit in the neighborhood. Malcolm organized a charity basketball tournament, using his team's popularity to draw a crowd. Zuri and Xavier started tutoring kids in math and science for extra cash. Amari began playing piano at local cafes, earning tips. Layla turned her poetry into greeting cards, selling them at craft fairs. Jaden, sweet, determined Jaden, set up a lemonade stand. Even Thomas's business contacts chipped in. Clients he had helped in the past, people who respected him, donated to the cause. And slowly, bit by bit, the money came in. But would it be enough? The final payment. A month later, Olivia and Malcolm sat across from a bank representative. The woman raised an eyebrow as she looked at the stack of cash and checks they had gathered. You're trying to save your home, she said slowly. Yes, Olivia said. We have the money. We just need an extension. The woman sighed. I'm sorry, kids. The rules. Malcolm leaned forward. We're not just kids, he said. We're a family. And this house isn't just a building. It's our home. You don't have to help us, but you should. The woman hesitated. Then she picked up the phone. Let me see what I can do. A home secured. The next morning, Thomas received a call. Mr. Whitmore. Yes. This is Linda from the bank. We've revised your mortgage terms. Your kids, they'd really fought for you. Thomas's breath hitched. We're accepting the payment. Your home is safe. The celebration. When Thomas told the kids the news, the house erupted in cheers. Malcolm fist-pumped the air. Aisha burst into tears. Jaden jumped into Thomas's arms, giggling. That night, they had a celebration dinner. Thomas looked around the table at his children, the family he never expected, the family that had fought for him just as hard as he had fought for them. You guys saved this house, he said, shaking his head. I don't even know how to thank you. You already did, Olivia said. You gave us a home. We just made sure you got to keep it. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. For the first time, he truly understood something. A house was just walls and floors. But a home was the people inside it. And this was his family. Forever. A future built on love. 1 year later, the Whitmore house was alive with laughter, movement, and love. It had been exactly 1 year since the Matthews siblings had saved their home. A year since Thomas had stood in his kitchen, staring at a foreclosure notice, feeling like his world was collapsing. Now, the house wasn't just saved, it was thriving. And so were they. Jaden was painting a mural on the backyard wall, his little fingers coated in bright colors. Zuri and Xavier were sitting at the kitchen counter, flipping through college acceptance letters. Layla was curled up in a chair, writing poetry. Malcolm was outside, practicing basketball drills. He had received an offer from a major university. And Thomas, he was watching it all with quiet pride, his heart full in a way he had never known before. They had come so far. But life had one more surprise waiting for them. The unexpected visitor. It happened on a rainy afternoon. Thomas was in the middle of helping Amari tune her piano when the doorbell rang. He frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. He walked to the door, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. When he opened it, his heart nearly stopped. A woman stood there, soaking wet from the rain, and she looked just like Olivia. Thomas's pulse thundered. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking past him into the house. "I'm looking for Olivia," she said. Thomas's stomach twisted, because he already knew who she was. She was their mother, a past that refused to stay buried. Thomas took a deep breath. "You should come inside." The woman, Serena Matthews, stepped in hesitantly. She looked nervous, and she should have been, because her children didn't know she was alive. The truth revealed. 15 minutes later, the family was gathered in the living room. Olivia sat frozen. Malcolm's hands were clenched into fists. And Serena, she looked at them like they were ghosts. "I know this is shocking," Serena said softly, "but I never wanted to leave you." Malcolm laughed bitterly. "You sure about that?" Serena swallowed. "I was in a car accident. I was in a coma for almost a year. By the time I woke up, you kids had been placed in foster care. I tried to get you back, but I wasn't in a good place." Olivia stared at her. "So you just gave up?" "No." Serena's voice broke. "I was homeless. I was struggling just to survive. By the time I was stable, they told me you were better off where you were." Silence. "Then, where were you when we were being split up?" Malcolm's voice was cold. "Where were you when Olivia was trying to keep us together? Where were you when we thought you were dead?" Tears slid down Serena's face. "I was lost, but I never stopped loving you." Zuri, always the quiet one, whispered, "Why now?" Serena exhaled shakily. "Because I finally found you." She turned to Thomas, her gaze full of gratitude and guilt. "And I know you're the reason they're safe." Thomas sat still, watching the scene unfold. He knew what he wanted to say. But this wasn't his moment. It was theirs. A painful decision. The next few days were tense. Serena stayed in a nearby hotel, respecting their space. Malcolm wanted nothing to do with her. Zuri was confused. Olivia was angry. And Thomas, he was torn. He had raised them for 2 years, fought for them, loved them, but she was their mother. Would they leave? Would he lose them? One night, as he sat on the patio, Olivia stepped outside. "You okay?" she asked. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "I should be asking you that." Olivia sighed, sitting next to him. "I don't know what to do." Thomas hesitated. Then softly he said, "What do you want?" She looked up at him, startled. "No one's asked me that before," she admitted. "You don't owe her anything," Thomas said carefully. "But you also don't have to shut her out if you don't want to." Olivia swallowed hard. "She left us." "I know. But she's my mom." "I know that too." She wiped her face. "What if I let her in and she leaves again?" Thomas took her hand. "Then I'll be right here," he said, "just like I always have been." A new beginning. A week later, the decision was made. Serena wouldn't take them away, but she would be in their lives. Malcolm didn't speak to her for months. Zuri kept her distance. But Olivia, she let herself try. It was a slow process, full of pain and hesitation. But she had a family, and she wasn't alone anymore. And Thomas, for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing them. Because they were his. And that would never change. A final celebration. On the 1-year anniversary of saving their home, the Whitmore family held a celebration. Music played, food filled the table, and laughter echoed through the house. Thomas stood back, watching them. Malcolm teasing Zuri, Layla reading poetry aloud, Olivia smiling, really smiling. This house, this family, was no longer something he had saved. They had saved him too. And no matter what came next, one thing was certain. They were together. And together, they could face anything. 2 years later, The Whitmore home had changed, but in all the best ways. The walls that were once silent and cold were now filled with warmth, laughter, and memories. Jaden's painting of their family still hung in the living room, a constant reminder of how far they had come. The Matthews siblings had not just found a home, they had built one. But the biggest transformation of all, Thomas. He was no longer just a rich businessman with an empty life. He was a father. The day everything changed. It was a normal Sunday morning when Olivia walked into the kitchen with an envelope in her hand. "Hey, Dad," she said, holding it up. Thomas, who had been attempting, and failing, to flip pancakes, turned around. "Yeah." She smiled nervously. "We all have something for you." At that moment, Malcolm, Zuri, Xavier, Amari, Layla, and Jaden entered the room, each holding a similar envelope. Thomas blinked. "What's this?" "We wanted to do this sooner," Olivia said, "but we had to wait until we were all old enough." "Wait for what?" Thomas asked, confused. "Just open it," Malcolm said, shoving an envelope into his hands. Thomas tore it open and stilled. Inside was a legal document. His heart stopped. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Petition legal name Chang," and beneath it, "Olivia Matthews, Olivia Whitmore. Malcolm Matthews, Malcolm Whitmore. Zuri Matthews, Zuri Whitmore. Xavier Matthews, Xavier Whitmore. Amari Matthews, Amari Whitmore. Layla Matthews, Layla Whitmore. Jaden Matthews, Jaden Whitmore." Thomas looked up, his throat tight. "Guys." Olivia smiled, tears in her eyes. "You saved us, Dad. Now we want to show you that you're really our father, in every way." Thomas couldn't speak. He glanced at Malcolm, the toughest one, the one who had fought him the hardest. "Malcolm?" he asked softly. Malcolm rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. "Took me a while," he muttered, "but you never gave up on us. And I guess that means you're stuck with us now." Thomas laughed wetly, shaking his head in disbelief. "I was never stuck," he whispered. "I was lucky." Jaden climbed onto his lap, wrapping his little arms around Thomas's neck. "Are you happy, Daddy?" he asked. Thomas hugged him tight. "I've never been happier." A new name, a new life. The adoption process had been finalized long ago. But now they were officially Whitmores. Not because Thomas had given them a home, not because he had provided for them, but because they had chosen him, just like he had chosen them. The final celebration. That evening, the family held a barbecue in the backyard. It wasn't a grand event. Just them. Just family. Thomas stood at the grill, flipping burgers while Malcolm attempted and failed to teach Layla how to throw a football. Zuri sat under the tree reading. Aisha was setting up the dessert table, laughing at something Xavier said. And Olivia. She sat beside Thomas, watching it all. "You did it," she murmured. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Did what?" "You gave us a family," she said. Thomas smiled softly. "You gave me one too." She bumped her shoulder against his. "So what's next, Dad?" Thomas looked out at his children, his home, his life, and he knew, whatever came next, they would face it together.